This is PowerPoint Lecture 1.5 for Survey of Economics on markets. And our particular emphasis here is going to be with imperfect markets, particularly monopolies. Most of what we have previously said, particularly concerning supply decisions and profit maximization, has dealt with, and equilibrium has dealt with perfectly competitive markets, and you see we'll discuss perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. First, let's deal with the different types of markets, and you see they're on a kind of a scale here, okay? You have perfectly competitive markets, and the diametric opposition of that is a monopoly. Perfectly competitive is where you have multiple producers, no differentiation of product, and none of the firms have market power. We'll define all of what that means here in a minute. A monopoly is where they have market power. There is only one firm that produces the entirety of the output. And then you have a scale in between. Monopolistic competition is closer to perfect competition than monopoly. Oligopoly, duopoly, okay. First, let's deal with perfect competition, which is where we've been for the most part. Competitive market, no firm has market power. And what this means is that the firms are what we call price takers. What it ultimately means is that in a competitive market, no firm has any control over the pricing whatsoever. So, for example, if we're in a competitive market and I try to raise my price to make more money, nobody's going to buy my product because they can just go and buy it from someone else. The classic example of this is a farmer's market. Okay, agricultural products typically are in a perfectly competitive market. Why? Well, because there's no product differentiation. My potatoes are the same as the farmer down the street. My corn is the same as theirs. Okay, and so as a result, there's nothing to differentiate my product from theirs, nothing to make mine superior to theirs. And so if I try to change my price, if I increase my price, then they can go down the street and buy the same product from someone else. Okay. And so in the perfectly competitive market, as we've been talking about, and what we saw in the previous slides, is that profit in the short run is terminal. The only way to perpetuate profit is to make investment decisions at a time to expand my productivity. And so profit in the short term, on the short run, is terminal. We are going to find that in the exact opposite of competitive market, monopoly, this is not the case. This is why ultimately what this is leading to is the explanation as to why it is that monopolies are inefficient, okay? Those of us who believe in a free market, to me, I mean, monopolies are the epitome of evil. I've battled all my life against monopolies, and we'll get to that in a minute, with greater and lesser degrees of success. When we deal with imperfect competition, we look at a number of different types, and it's largely based on the number of firms that produce and entry barriers to other firms entering the market, and to some degree also product differentiation. This is true particularly in monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition is very similar to perfect competition. You have many firms supplying effectively the same product, okay, substitutes for one another. However, each of them enjoys a certain brand loyalty. What you can do with monopolistic competition is there is product differentiation. Okay, and so for example, if you can tell the difference between two types, classic example, automobiles. That's a monopolistically competitive market. Ford and Chevy. Okay, they serve as substitutes for each other. They're both automobiles. They both can be driven. Okay, but there is a certain amount of brand loyalty. You can differentiate between these two products. I wouldn't drive a Ford if you paid me to drive a Ford. I'm a Chevy man, okay? I'm also a Nissan man. Two of the last three cars I've owned are Nissans. I like those. But at any rate, okay? But Nissan is another one you can throw in there in that monopolistically competitive market because you can differentiate between the products, okay? Now, an oligopoly is where you have only a few firms that supply all or most of the commodity. The classic example of this is OPEC. okay, which is the petroleum exporting countries. A little less classic examples are some of the drug cartels that are very famous in the media, particularly the Medellin cartel, the Cali cartels. They control the vast majority of cocaine production and shipment throughout the world. Okay, and we'll deal with how they control here in a minute. And then finally, a monopoly is where one firm produces the entire market for any given product. And therefore, monopolists have market power and they are price makers. This puts them in diametric opposition to our competitive markets. To amplify a little bit on monopolistic competition, as I've said, product differentiation is the key here. Okay, so Ford versus Chevy versus Nissan versus Toyota. Okay, monopolist, if you can differentiate between the products, it's monopolistic competition. That's why we said farmers markets, I can't tell the difference between one potato and the other. But with potato chips, that's a different ballgame. You have Lay's, you have Hares, you used to have Eagle snacks, you have any number, okay, of different types. Go to a grocery store sometime. And so anything you're going to see on your shelf, most of the things you see on the shelves, not in the produce section, but most of the things you see on the shelves of your grocery store, that's monopolistic competition. Okay, gasoline tends to be competitive, not monopolistic competition. However, service stations are monopolistically competitive. Automobile mechanics are different. Okay, they provide effectively the same service, but there is a distinction, there is a differentiation in their product. There are very limited entry barriers. Okay, so it's closer to perfect competition than monopoly in that degree. And the telltale sign is you're sitting there watching television. If you see advertisements for a product, then that product's in a monopolistically competitive market. Okay, that's why you don't see advertisements for potatoes and for corn and for soybeans, okay? Because it makes no sense to advertise. They're the same, all right? Whereas you do see for Doritos and for Lay's and for Ford and for Chevy and even for universities. It was the first time I saw an actual television ad for Robert Morris University. It was kind of nice, filled me with a certain amount of Robert Morris pride. But at any rate, that's monopolistic competition. As we've said, in oligopolies, duopolies, monopolies, in the oligopoly, the few firms control the entire commodity. Now, how the oligopolist is going to exercise market power, how oligopolies are going to exercise market power, is through the manipulation of the supply of their product. We hearken back to the original discussion in 1.3 regarding supply. And what we remember is that if you drop the supply of something, if you shift the supply curve inward, it's going to raise the price of the product. This is how an oligopoly will control the price of their product. That's how OPEC controls the price of their product. And we don't get into it in survey. We get into it in a little bit more detail in microeconomics, where we go into it a little bit more depth. But there is an inherent problem with oligopolies, okay? The problem with oligopoly in a nutshell is the idea of defection. The only way an oligopoly works is if all of the members of that oligopoly agree to the control over the supply. Okay, this is why OPEC has been having trouble recently. This is why, for example, oil prices in the last 4 months, 5 months, have slid at times below $50 a barrel. You know, at their height, they hit close to a little over $100 a barrel. Well, the reason for this is you have too much defection going on. Not all of the suppliers are agreeing to these supply quotas. There are a lot of oil producers now that are not members of OPEC. This is because of more discoveries. So the more people that produce the product, okay, the harder it is to maintain an oligopoly, okay, because there is an incentive to defect from any kind of control over supply that the oligopoly tries to exert. That's why OPEC's lost a lot of its power over the years. A duopoly is where two firms supply all or most of the commodity. I just mentioned it here because it's there. Monopoly is really the focus of most of our attention here. That's where you have one firm that produces the entire market of a given product. Okay, and we'll deal with that at greater length when we dive in. In dealing with monopolies, okay, you have effectively three types, one of which is very unique and actually is going the way of the dodo. It's dying out. There's not as many as there used to be. But the first two we look at are vertical monopolies and horizontal monopolies. And they're very different animals. A vertical monopoly is where a firm controls all of the inputs as well as produces the final product. The classic example of this is U.S. Steel under Andrew Carnegie at the turn of the 20th century. Okay? What we have there is we have the Andrew Carnegie Steel Corporation controlled iron mines, coal mines, railroads, etc., all of the intermediate goods that go into the production of a product. Okay, and so, for example, if we were an automobile corporation, if we owned steel mills, aluminum mills, iron mines, aluminum mines, railroads to transport it, that would make us a vertical monopoly. Okay, what that allows for is that allows for me as a vertical monopolist, I can be perfectly well, I can be in a competitive industry, or a monopolistically competitive industry anyways, for my final product. But it gives me an advantage because I control all of the inputs. I can then control the price of those inputs. That will reduce the cost of production for my final product and give me a competitive advantage. Okay, this is what happened with Andrew Steel. That's why he was able to gobble up all of his competition. He was in the latter part of the 19th century, steel was a very competitive industry in the United States. There were many firms producing it. Okay, Carnegie, however, was able to gobble up everybody else because he also controlled all of the intermediate goods going into the production of steel. Therefore, he could keep those goods very low priced, which would reduce his cost of production, which gave him a competitive advantage. Okay, this was particularly true when he parlayed this into a horizontal monopoly. Horizontal monopoly is what most people commonly think of as a monopoly. This is where you have 100% market share for a finished product. Okay, after the unification with J.P. Morgan, okay, and J. Paul Getty's Steel, at the end of the 19th century in 1901, the U.S. Steel Corporation, okay, Carnegie Steel and the others, married together, okay, in a merger. And once they did this, they controlled better than 90% of all of the production of steel in the United States. That makes them monopolistic, okay? Horizontal monopolies are where they control the entire product. And we have, there's a lot to this, okay? And again, in micro, we deal with it at greater length. We also deal with it at greater length in the class free market economics. But I'll give you some examples of things that were traditionally horizontal monopolies, okay? I'll give you one example, public education. Public education going up through high school, okay? Everybody went to the same school. Okay, where I went to school, I graduated locally, actually. I graduated from Baldwin High School. Okay, everybody in my area went to Baldwin High School. Now, it wasn't quite entirely monopolistic. You had people that would send their kids to parochial schools. Now those monopolies, the monopoly of public education, is beginning to break down. Okay, it's beginning to break down because of charter schools, online charter schools particularly, and things like that. But that's, okay, another monopoly that used to have a horizontal monopoly were utility companies. Okay, one of the ones that I'm currently going into battle with, which is a horizontal monopoly, is the Rochester Area Joint Sewer Authority. They own all of the sewer lines that bring water to and from all of the houses in Rochester. That gives them a horizontal monopoly. And what those Guys, done with their monopoly. 10 years ago when I moved in here, I was paying $11 a month, billed every 3 months. Okay, then they jacked that to $19 a month and started billing every month. Now it seems to be a floating target. It's around $19 a month, but then every 3 months they put an additional charge of $40 or $50 on there. Okay, what can I do about that? Nothing. Do I want water at my house? Yes, I want water at my house. Then I have to pay them. That gives them a lot of market power. That's a horizontal monopoly. One of the things that we deal with and discuss in free market economics is what alternatives do we have to these guys that are horizontal monopolies? Another example, in the state of Pennsylvania, some years back, 10 years ago, if you look at 20 or 30 years ago, utility companies, electric, gas, natural gas, okay, they were horizontal monopolies, okay? They had complete control of the market. That's not as true anymore. What they did about 10 years ago is they opened it up that other people can produce power, okay? And so like for years now, I've been with IGS Energy. They produce my power. Duquesne Light, for example, the people that are the light company here, there's West Penn Power and there's Duquesne Light. Where I am in Rochester is Duquesne Light. Duquesne Light doesn't produce electricity anymore, okay? It's not cost effective for them to. What they do is they transport the electricity, okay? So while I'm able, and it's a very competitive market, it's extremely exciting and a lot of fun. You can go online, okay, and shop for electricity and look at the kilowatts per hour and the length of terms of the contract, okay? Those are all things that we can control. That gives me a certain amount of market power and takes it away from the producer. However, that's only so effective because Duquesne Light still has horizontal monopolistic control over all of the power lines, okay? If I want power in my house, I have to pay Duquesne Light's fee for producing that, for transporting that power. The way it actually works is I pay the producer of the power, IGS. IGS pays Duquesne Light a fee for transporting that power, okay? But that's how horizontal monopolies and how they've changed over time. The unique case that I mentioned is what we refer to as a natural monopoly. This is a very specific animal, okay? Duquesne Light utilities typically serve, or at least served, as natural monopolies. They are a unique case. They bear no resemblance, okay, well, they bear some resemblance to the horizontal monopolies that we're talking about, like the U.S. Steel Corporation at the turn of the 20th century, okay? The defining feature of a natural monopoly is that the average total cost of production at the profit maximizing level of output is higher than the price that the market will bear, okay? So cost is higher than the revenue that it would produce. As a result of this, it will not be profitable and no one will produce it, okay? In the 19th century, railroads were in this. When AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph, first formed in the early 20th century, they were a natural monopoly. The defining feature is that the cost of production is greater than the price that the market will bear. You can't make enough money at it to cover your costs. Largely the reason for this is because of the upfront cost of production. Let's take an example of the Duquesne Light Company, okay? They had to lay all of those power lines, all of the wires. That's an enormous sunken cost, an enormous initial investment. That means their average total cost of production for a kilowatt of power is very high because of that. As a result, you can't allow competition because what's going to happen in competition is the price is going to drop. We've seen this again and again and again. If we allow competition, okay, the price will drop and it will drop below the average total cost. Another example of this is airlines when they first formed. Okay, airplanes were exceptionally expensive. When they were first formed, that sunken cost, okay, that initial investment was so high that if you allowed competition to go on, the price would naturally drop for reasons that we saw previously. Okay, and when the price drops, it'll drop below the average total cost, making it unprofitable, and no one will want to do it. And when we get to macroeconomics, this was the original, well, not quite the original, but almost the original reason for government regulation of the economy. The first things the government regulated were natural monopolies. Okay? This was what Theodore Roosevelt did. This was what he was known for as a trust buster, was to try to create more competition and regulate these natural monopolies. Okay? Because they are monopolistic and they're the only firm producing it, and because no competition can come in because of the high upfront costs, they're free to charge whatever the market will bear. They're free to charge whatever they want. Okay? And as a result of that, that was the first reason for government intervention. The government would come in and regulate them and limit the amount of profit they can do. Government still does that. In the state of Pennsylvania, we have the Public Utilities Commission. The Public Utilities Commission puts a cap on the amount of fee that Duquesne Light and West Penn Power and Columbia Gas, they're another one, they put a cap on the price that can be charged for transportation through their lines of natural gas or electric or whatever. One of the unique cases I have down here are pharmaceuticals. People mistakenly think that owning a pharmaceutical company like Pfizer or Merck is a license to print money, that these guys make profits hand over fist. That's not entirely true. Okay, pharmaceutical companies exist in a very competitive market. Okay, it is not perfectly competitive, it is monopolistically competitive. They exist in a very competitive market. They face exceptionally high upfront costs when it comes to research and development. What pharmaceutical companies do is they all work on the development of new drugs for any number of reasons, for any number of things. Okay, they face an enormous upfront cost. Therefore, what the government grants them is, if they successfully get their drug through the Food and Drug Administration and it gets to market, they grant them a 5-year exclusive patent, a monopoly on the production of that drug. Because if everyone else produced it as well, once it came out on the market, if everyone else ripped it off and produced it as well, okay, that would increase supply, drive the price level down, and the pharmaceutical company that developed the drug wouldn't be able, okay, to cover the costs of developing it. Most pharmaceutical companies, most drugs that pharmaceutical companies pursue, about 85% of the drugs they pursue never make it to market. They eat all of these upfront costs and never see dime one in revenue because they don't make it to market. Either the FDA kills it or another pharmaceutical company beats them to the punch and markets it first. Okay, and so they get this 5-year. Now, once the 5-year patent is done, then it becomes competitive. Okay, and when it becomes competitive, it becomes perfect competition. This is why we have generic drugs. Okay, when you first market a drug, when they first market a drug, it's a brand name drug. Okay, that bears the name given by the pharmaceutical company that has a 5-year patent on it. That's where they make their profits. That's why they're so expensive. But after 5 years, anyone can now produce it, and it becomes generic. Okay, and the price of it goes down exorbitantly. Okay, by a factor of 10. It'll drop the 10% the price or less. Okay, and so they're kind of a unique case for a natural monopoly. Patents in general work that way. We now want to discuss how our imperfectly competitive market, particularly monopolies, differ from competitive markets in terms of profit. Okay, it starts, if you can remember, when we dealt with this in the last lecture. To determine the profit maximizing level of output, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Money in per unit equals money out per unit. Okay? And for the competitive market, and the more competitive the market is, the more this is true, the marginal revenue and the price are the same thing. These are reflected, you see here, these are reflected in the demand curve. This is not true for the monopolist. For the monopolist, the marginal revenue that they make per unit and the price are not the same thing. Price is going to be greater than marginal revenue. Okay? In technical terms, and when we get into this more technically, like in microeconomics or in some of the more advanced economics, we actually look at the marginal revenue. The marginal revenue curve is half the demand curve. Okay? In terms of its slope. Now let's look at how that works and follow off the logic here. Because when I first learned this as an undergraduate, it took me a little while to come to the logic behind this. Okay? It has to do, it's predicated on an inability to price discriminate. We'll just rest there for just a second, because price discrimination means that I can charge a different price to all of my different customers. I don't have a uniform price. Okay? Now let's look at the monopolist that cannot price discriminate. A utility company. They have to charge the same to everyone. Okay? And actually the way it works is the SEC now, there are regulations regarding that. So let's take a look at our monopolist. If our monopolist produces one, they can sell it at $20. That gets them $20 in revenue. With a marginal revenue, now remember what marginal revenue is. Don't move too far from what marginal revenue is conceptually. It's the change in total revenue from the sale of one additional unit of the product. This is the unique case where price and marginal revenue are the same. But the only way the monopolist can sell a second unit of the product is if they charge a lower price from the get-go. That's not true of our competitor. Okay? And so if they want to sell 2 units, they have to charge $18. You see that this goes along with the law of demand, right? If they want to sell 3, they have to drop the price to 16. 4, they drop the price to 14. 7, they drop the price to 8. 9, they drop the price to 4. Now let's look at the revenue. If they sell 1 unit at $20, they get $20 in revenue with a marginal revenue of $20. But for them to sell 2 units, they have to drop the price of both of them to $18. That's going to get them $36 in revenue. Well, the difference between selling the first unit and the second unit is $16 in revenue. And so your marginal revenue from that second unit is $16. Then 12, then 8, then 4, then 0. Then they actually start making negative marginal revenue. Okay? All right. We'll look at that graphically here. Now, the decision regarding profit maximization is the same for the monopolist as it is for the competitor. Okay? Where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that's your profit maximizing level of production. Okay? The difference has to do with the distinction between price and marginal revenue. For our competitor, price and marginal revenue are the same thing. Not so for our monopolist. For our monopolist, here is the demand curve, which is reflective of the price. Here is the marginal revenue curve. Okay? Always less than the price curve. This is what we see from our table. Okay? So the monopolist is going to produce, just as the competitor is, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. that point right there. Now, for the competitor, they're going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but their marginal revenue is the same as the demand line. So they'll produce here, okay, for a higher cost. Now, what that means is that because the monopolist can produce down here, look where the price is on the demand curve. For this level of quantity, consumers will be willing to pay this much, meaning they can make all of this in profit. Profit is the distance between your total cost and the price of your product. This is average total cost. What does that mean? We know this from previously. That's the cost per unit of product. A little bit different than marginal cost. Marginal cost is the change in cost based on the production of one additional unit. Average total cost, you take your total cost and divide it by the number of units you've produced. So the difference between the average total cost and the price of the product, that's your profit. Okay? And so for our monopolist, they make this in profit. Let's look at our competitor. Our competitor produces as the monopolist did, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, the difference being that for the competitor, the marginal revenue curve is the same as the demand curve. So they can charge this much and maximize profit. Well, look at the distance, the distance from the average total cost curve. Here's the total cost. Here's the price. So our competitor gets to make this much profit, much less. We'll deal with that at greater length in just a minute. Okay, and this just summarizes what I've just gone over. The decision regarding profit is the same. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The difference is that for the competitor, marginal revenue and price are the same thing, and therefore they're the same as demand. For the monopolist, that is not true. Marginal revenue is less than the price. Here I amplify that graph we just looked at, and we draw some other conclusions. Okay, first of all, what we see is here's the profit maximizing level of production for our monopolist. Okay, the distance between the average, the cost at that production level per unit and the price at that production, that's the profit. You see the large profit area here. Okay, for our competitor, they're going to make a profit in this situation as well. Here's where they're going to produce. That's the price. This is the cost per unit. So they're making this much profit per unit. Okay, now the other thing we note, and we noted that before 2 slides ago, the other thing we note here, which is significant, is the difference in production levels. The monopolist underproduces. They produce less. Okay, this is going to make them very similar. This is where oligopolies get their strength from. They borrow it from the monopolist. They produce less because they don't face any competition. They don't have to worry about anybody else producing more. That enables them to make this enormous profit. Okay, so the two things that are true is that monopolies tend to be underproductive. They produce less than a competitive market, and they tend to make more profit. All right, and that's kind of intuitive. Now we want to extend that just a bit to think of the ramifications that that has to, for example, levels of employment or unemployment. Okay, because our competitor produces at a higher level to maximize profit, they produce more, therefore they'll need more laborers. Our monopolist, to maximize profit, produces less. Okay, because they produce less, they don't need as many laborers. Okay, so it has ramifications on employment levels. Now, for the firm functioning under conditions of perfect competition, because MR is D, their profit maximizing level of production is the same as marginal cost equals D. Okay, This exerts a downward pressure on prices and hence reduces profits. Okay. Note the blue line in the illustration. This is just what I've said. Okay. Here's where we get to the main argument. As a result of this, monopolies are inherently inefficient. I mentioned at the outset that I have, for my entire adult life, been at war with monopolies. Okay, my first job ever was working for the Pennsylvania Alliance for Jobs and Energy. And what we did was we went door to door. I was a door-to-door canvasser trying to raise money to fund lobbying agencies that would lobby the Pennsylvania Utility Commission in Harrisburg to force greater regulation down on these monopolistic firms like Duquesne Light, like West Penn Power, like Columbia Gas. Okay. Since then, I've gone to war with the electric company. One time I went to war with the electric company, and I went simultaneously to war with the post office. Okay, for years, the post office was a natural monopoly because the delivery of mail was so high in its average total cost that you couldn't charge enough. If competition took place, the downward pressure on prices from competition would reduce it below average total cost, and nobody would make any money, and no mail would be delivered. Okay, my war with the post office went very well. In fact, it's been a victory. The post office has gotten crushed in the daily delivery of mail, principally by the internet. Okay, emails, and for years now, for about the last 15 years, the post office has unsuccessfully been attempting to lobby Congress to pass a restriction on that and force people to pay the same amount they would pay to post a letter to post an email, 49 cents. Okay, so every email you send would be 49 cents, the same as it is with a letter. They've been completely unsuccessful in this. As a result, their natural monopoly is cracked. Okay, the Duquesne Light monopoly has cracked to some degree, okay, in the production of power, but they still have it in the delivery of power. And one of the things my free market class and I went over was how to try to crack that. And we've come up with some things. We won't get into it here. We get into that in free market economics, which is, I think, next semester being taught by Professor O'Rourke. So take that if you're interested. But there are ways around it. You just have to be creative. Like having your own generator would help do that. You wouldn't have to have power delivered to your house. But at any rate, the problem was I went to war with the post office at the same time that I went to war with Duquesne Light. This is kind of, I went to war with the post office in Hiram, Ohio. I was teaching at Hiram College up there in Hiram, Ohio, 30 miles southeast of Cleveland. And I went to war with the post office because what the post office was doing, the post office did not have home delivery. You had to go to the post office. You had to go to the post office and pick up your mail in a post office box. My argument was, look, the people that are sending me letters are paying, at the time, I think it was 42 cents, are paying 42 cents. That 42 cents is supposed to get that letter from them to me, not from them to the post office box. Okay? So I refused. I refused to pay. Well, they didn't deliver, so my mail stacked up. At the same time, I was at war with Duquesne Light. Well, one of the things that stacked up at the post office was my electric bill, and so I didn't get it. This was before the internet, so I didn't get it. So as a result, I came home one day, flipped on the power switch, and there was no electricity. Okay, but I figured this was a fundamentally flawed strategy on my part. I will grant you that. I figured, well, screw that. You know, I'm kind of an outdoorsman kind of guy. Okay, I lived on the organic. I was like, I can do without electricity. Okay, there's a problem with that thinking. What I hadn't thought about was on the heating end of it. The furnace that I had was forced heat. Well, the way that heat was forced throughout my house was a fan. That fan ran on electric power. So while I might be able to get by without the electricity, if I don't have the heat, I'm going to freeze to death. Okay, and so that's my war. And the reason for it is because monopolies are inefficient. Okay, what we looked at before, what creates efficiency, okay, allocative efficiency is where price equals the marginal cost. Okay, ultimately where price equals the minimum marginal cost. If you have competition in our competitive market, the existence of profit is going to compel more people to produce it. That's going to shift the supply curve outward to the right. The result will be a decline in price. That decline in price will continue until the industry-wide price is equal to the minimum marginal cost. That's allocative efficiency, where society is paying to produce the thing per unit marginal cost as much as it values the thing, okay, reflected in the price. This does not happen with monopolies. This does not happen with monopolies because monopolies don't face competition. And so they can perpetually run a profit, create a condition where the price is always greater than the marginal cost. Monopolies are guaranteed a profit. No one in free market economics, you, me, anybody, is guaranteed a profit. That's the whole idea. They are. That's why they're anathema. Now, in terms of average total cost, we have a very similar situation. In terms of average total cost, the producer has no incentive to drive total cost down. They have no incentive to drive total cost down because they do not face any competition. In a competitive situation, okay, ultimately productive efficiency is where price equals the minimum average total cost throughout the industry. And anyone that cannot produce at that minimum average total cost is driven out of the industry. Okay? Not our monopolist. They don't have to produce for the minimum average total cost. Why? Because there's no competition. Okay? They don't face the same kind of downward pressure. The downward pressure is always created. We learned this last time. The downward pressure is created because if profit exists, more people will want to produce the thing. When they begin producing, and this counts for labor as well. Okay, this counts for, the more profit there is in nursing, the more profit there is in graphics design, the more people will want to do it. That's going to drive the price down. That's going to slide the supply curve outward to the right and drive the price down. If you have no competition, there is no pressure to do this. And so our monopolists can charge greater than the average total cost and maintain this perpetual profit. It goes through me like a rusty steel nail that they're able to do that. Okay?